My name is Kyle. I'm the CEO here at Reviewr. Kind of why we're qualified to have this conversation today. We're one of the leading grant making or grant management softwares within the space. So really kind of everything from grant applications all the way through like review and selection process. And ideally for many of you, the ongoing kind of grant deliverables and reporting and impact that we have on our programs. We named the company Reviewr because that was the life that we lived. So I think we're kind of in a very unique position where back about 12 years ago, we served on volunteer review committees, reading through, grant applications, scholarship programs, and funding. We live that life of, going from binders and paper to online. And this may be where many of you live. When organizations try to go online to kind of streamline processes, it really meant a lot of emails, spreadsheets, downloading of documents. And so, from a volunteer evaluator perspective, we were kind of put in a very tough position. We're given very tight deadlines. We have a very important task. We're downloading documents, offering feedback in spreadsheets, and it became extremely overwhelming. Equally, if not more problematic, though, was like the negative impact on processes. So, kind of two very terrible things started happening. Number one is information got lost and misplaced. So entire funding cycles would go on, and we'd find out months later that there are people who said that they applied or organizations who said they applied that we never looked at. So we cut checks, went through funding, and then unfortunately, 6 months later, we found out that there's people in spam filters or their information was lost. We also started to see kind of a disconnect amongst review staff and committees with like different expectations and how they wanted to score applicants. We were seeing data we probably shouldn't see, so highly sensitive, non-redacted information, and that led to some biases in the review process. So long story short, we built Reviewr very selfishly to make our own lives easier, but also kind of as a broader picture, how do we elevate the experience for everybody involved? With all that said, we're in a very, I guess, fortunate position to work with thousands and thousands of these organizations every year. So not only do we provide the platform, but also we're kind of at the forefront of understanding and hearing like what's happening on a daily basis, what type of challenges are impacting you guys, and also what kind of emerging trends and best practices and insights are happening within the space, which brings us full circle today of how do we kind of take that and make it into a very digestible manner, and then give it back to you guys. So my goal here is to kind of talk through kind of three core experiences from an applicant perspective, operationally, and then also from like the review and selection side of things. I'm not naive. You guys have a very tough job, and I don't think people realize, unless they're involved on the daily basis of managing scholarships and grants, how much actually goes into it. You're tasked with such an important and incredible role because you're changing organizations and people's lives. And so, how do we start to take, what's happening right now within other organizations that are very common and very unique, best practices and emerging trends, and try to convert them into like actionable next steps, also powered by tools and technology. So, we're going to jump around here just a little bit. We're not going to kind of follow any kind of standard format. And the first thing I want to kind of look at today is the future of AI. So it's obviously a very hot topic right now. I'm not sure if anybody wants to leave any comments in the chat or react with emoji. If this is like a topic that you're currently exploring internally, I think maybe to preface this just a little bit, I think we like to use the term AI as like a catch-all topic, when in reality, not everything is artificial intelligence. It's using kind of like technology and tools with some advanced automations and workflow management that can kind of help streamline things without really using artificial intelligence. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today are covered here in this list, and we'll kind of run through them really quickly. Things that we're doing right now, but at the same time, we're very heavily vested working with our current clients to kind of figure out like where does actual artificial intelligence provide significant value, not just helping streamline time and operations, but also just overall, elevating the experience for people participating. On top of that, obviously, ethics are a big concern when you kind of get into this. So, kind of our commitment is building kind of like an ethics committee amongst our current clients to kind of find that balancing act of like how far and how deep that we want to go. So I'm not going to go through this entire list. Again, I'll share this back out afterwards. You've got kind of different extremes and different ends of the spectrum of like where these types of tools and technologies can provide value. On the very obvious side of things, which we'll kind of get into, is like how do we help, vet and streamline like eligibility or kind of help match applicants with funding opportunities that they best align with. How do you take kind of like comprehensive grant applications and portfolios and summarize the content into a much more digestible manner, giving your team kind of a very quick high level overview of like who the applicants are, building personas around them, and then leveraging that to make kind of decisions on like vetting processes or equipping your review team for success versus giving them like these really complex portfolios or packets to review. From there, you kind of get deeper into like some of the automation. So like communication, potentially doing like sentiment analysis where you can actually in real time read applicant information to kind of get a pulse for like, the quality of the work and how they align or differentiate themselves versus other candidates. And then on the very trail end of things, you can have theoretically completely automated review and selection, where as people are applying to funding opportunities, leveraging tools and AI, the system could read their submissions, kind of go back and do historical analysis from your own grant making initiatives, and kind of figure like, does this align with other projects or organizations that you funded in the past? And then if so, it can kind of help rank them and score them for you. Again, that's like the most extreme example. My kind of fair warning to those that are kind of going down that path and exploring it is, why we built Reviewr in the first place is that we've got decades and decades of, quite frankly, bias and flawed processes in reviewing and scoring. And so the models that we have to kind of train that to make those selections for us are also going to be very heavily flawed. And a question just came in as like, is there a built-in process for humans to review applicants that have been filtered? Thank you for making that comment. I think that's kind of where I personally stand. Now, AI is evolving tremendously, right? Like this list will change tomorrow, and how our sentiment is going to change, within a week. But right now, I feel like we want to leverage tools like AI or like the other advanced algorithms that we're going to get into to kind of help structure your programs and kind of create efficiencies and summarize information, and then start to leverage a human to kind of cross-reference and check this type of stuff and make real human impact decision making on top of that. If we do that enough times, we have confidence in it, then we can start to let AI kind of take over. So let's start to run through, I think, some of these emerging trends, because a lot of these elements, such as eligibility screening or summarizing of content, are going to be addressed. But then to your point, who left that message? I feel very passionate that like we often think of these programs as data, right? You've got budgets and portfolios and projects being submitted. You've got score sheets and selections coming in. But they're not just data. These are people and their organizations. And there's a broad group on the call today, grant making organizations, scholarship providers. And I think it's really important for us as we kind of go down this digital path to also kind of take a step back and look at it from a more human perspective. The people who are applying to your programs are doing it for a reason, and they deserve the fair shot and opportunity. And to get to that point, there's a lot of kind of tactics that we can put into place. And sometimes I feel like, fully automating or having like AI make decisions for us removes that kind of human touch to it. So I just wanted to kind of preface that there. I think right now, I won't use any names. Like there's some lawsuits that are happening within the space on like the human resource side of things where you've got like job candidates who are applying for jobs, and within like 5 minutes, they're getting like automated notifications saying, sorry, you don't align with this job position, where there's just no physical way that a person was actually able to read that or make a subjective thought or feedback on them. So that's kind of what we want to avoid. So with all that said, again, I'll share this back out, but I want to just preface first that says, number one is I think we have to be very careful with how companies and organizations out there try to promote themselves as AI platforms. Yes, there is 100% AI that can be beneficial to you guys, but there's also some downsides to that. And a lot of the elements are here don't really require artificial intelligence and kind of sharing your data with some of these platforms. They can be baked directly into your own kind of ecosystem and tool set. So with all that said, let's kind of jump through some of the applicant experience elements. You will notice I do have a note here on references. I am going to toss a quick little message in the chat here. I'm very curious for those of you in your grant making process, or if you're a scholarship provider, are you collecting like letters of support or recommendations about the person applying or candidate? Or do you have like other people who are contributing and offering insights about that applicant for you guys? And we'll kind of come back to that. So the first thing I want to take a look at is eligibility, grant eligibility and matching. So to kind of like go down like a storytelling path, and again, I want to keep this conversation relatively short and concise today. So many of you have very unique grant opportunities. They might be research or funding applications. They might be targeting a very certain niche or demographic of people. And a lot of times what happens is two things. You've got applicants who are in dire need of funding, just literally applying to everything and anything and everything. And the challenge to that is they're not even eligible. So a large amount of their time ends up getting wasted applying when, again, they have no chance of achieving success. And then on the trail end, you guys are spending a substantial number of time, number one, making sure that they meet your eligibility requirements. And then number two, kind of checking through to make sure that all like the deliverables and the documents that match those requirements are being submitted. And so we can definitely combat that. Number two is that some of you might offer a large number of different types of grants, or your grants are very, very particular. And so there might be individuals or organizations out there who are attempting to apply or they want to submit, but they have no idea what opportunities are even available to them or what they align with. So one of our core kind of features and concepts here at Reviewr is about building an applicant persona, again, to elevate their experience. So let's take a really quick peek. We'll definitely be looking at Reviewr here today to help visualize these concepts, but by no means, obviously, do you have to use our system to power these. Obviously, it's a huge benefit, but you guys can incorporate this into your daily lives now. So the general idea here is that there are so many moving parts that goes into like a grant making process. You've got people, you've got submissions, which I say plural because it may not just be like their initial application. You might do like an LOI, a full proposal, and then those that get selected have to come back and do like fund disbursement forms. They might have to do impact or grant reporting templates. So there's multiple forms that are coming in. You've got communication, you've got judging and scoring processes that are happening. And so the only way that any of these topics that we're going to talk about today can be systematized is to consolidate everything into one hub. So I call that a profile. So the grantee basically tells us who they are, and then it drops them into the applicant experience. So the number one goal here has to be to lower the barrier for their success, right? Again, these are life-changing opportunities for them and their organizations. We want all of their thought and energy to go towards creating their best content to differentiate themselves versus other potential grantees. We want systems and tools to interact with them, not vice versa. So in this model, if you have multiple different grants, you can certainly have them ask or answer a question and then pick what grant they're trying to apply for. The thought here, though, is that we can kind of ask them to answer a short series of questions. And this is kind of like one of the takeaway action items for you guys is to think through like what are the core eligibility requirements or things that you're looking for within an organization or candidate, write them out. And then in theory, what happens is when applicants are applying, they just answer a series of short form contents and choices. And then in real time, the system can do a quick check that aligns with your eligibility requirements. And then not only can we say, yes, you are eligible to proceed on, yes or no, or it could also say, not only are you eligible to proceed on, but these are the three different grants that we have, or in some cases, the one grant that you actually are eligible for and align with. And then from there, they can just make their selection. And then the goal from this point of view is to have very concise data collection. So if I choose the Lennox Wilder grant, I can be displayed a completely different kind of grant application than if I would have chose like the Brooke Marlowe grant. So it's very adaptive, very systematized. Obviously, this is all mobile friendly, but the goal there is to help you guys kind of go through that high-arching kind of vetting process of taking your applicant pool and then kind of disseminating them to where they belong, but also at the same time, making sure that every single person that submits is not only eligible, but they're eligible for the right program and that their profiles are complete. There's nothing more frustrating than you guys going through this process and then having to kind of reach back out to potential grantees saying, hey, we didn't get this from you, or we need this from you as well. So we structure the grant making application where everything is required. They can save, they can log out, they can come back later. But the goal is that once they actually kind of formally go through that process, once it's been submitted, we have extreme confidence that they're the right people for the right program, and we've got everything that we need from them to go through our review and selection. Another item too on this list is grant management systems. That's kind of like an implied given. I talked about how like the only way that you can accomplish any of these elements is to create like a systematized approach to it. So obviously like those grant profiles are part of it. While we're here though, I just want to kind of showcase like the power that you have. So with a dedicated kind of grant making program, you should be able to visually see in real time like what's going on. So dates and deadlines, how many entrants you've received. Are they done or not done? If they're not done, obviously sending out reminder messages. One of the things that you guys can kind of check out on your own time is some of the communication elements. I'm a very transparent person. I think, as people are applying for these programs, one of the worst experiences that they can have is to kind of click submit or they ship off their work to you guys and then they never hear back, right? Or like 6 months goes by and then they finally get some type of random notification. So The idea here and the kind of takeaway action steps is to kind of go through like a content calendar and like what are the different types of touch points that we can have across the program. So the reason why I brought that up is in Reviewr, at least, ideally speaking, once they create their profiles, they get like a welcome message for you guys, right? Like some type of like really good high value providing element right away. Maybe it's like an email that has like a link to like other grant writing initiatives or resources to kind of put them into a better position for success. From there, we can start to see are they done or not done. If they're not done, we can automate the reminder process. It's human nature to procrastinate and wait to the very last minute. So if we can kind of help put them into a stronger position, that's great. And then for those that kind of proceed on to like, okay, they got selected for a grant or for a scholarship. Now we need them to come back and do like a grant reporting template or an impact survey, which we're going to come back to. We can see who those people are, have they actually done it or not? If they haven't done it, send them reminders, etc. So the idea is to kind of think through like the entire stage of your program and start to figure out like what points of communication can we have or inject at each one of them, and then how do we start to automate those. But kind of where I was getting at with this, it was like the real-time visibility of who people are, and then the ability to kind of send them those different types of reminders. So nobody, I don't think, reacted to the comment around collecting letters of recommendation or support. So I'm going to kind of just really briefly touch on that. It's becoming an emerging trend, and that's why I added this. This is a very core concept for scholarship providers that has absolutely permeated into grant making. So one of the biggest challenges that we have is how do we differentiate one applicant or one candidate or organization from one another? Again, in such a data-driven metric world, we're looking at like budgets, project needs analysis, all that kind of fun stuff. But how do you let their personalities and kind of their writing showcase and help differentiate themselves versus other people? And one of the best ways that we can do that is through a concept called references. So in this example, what basically happens is the applicant can put in like the name or email of the external organization that's writing a reference on their behalf. I'm going to come back to this because there's other use cases, but the idea is that it actually can trigger an email notification to them saying, hey, so and so, Reviewr has applied to one of our grants. They're asking you to write a recommendation letter on their support. Click here to do so. And then the idea is they'll bring them directly into the reference portal where they can not only upload a reference letter, or one of the things that a lot of people would have reacted, they could fill out is a reference template. So reference letters are very old school. They're very hard to write. It's a better reflection of the writing ability of the reference. So instead, push them towards like a templated model where they're actually evaluating the applicant or organization on qualities that align with your mission and vision, and or offer like what are two or three very short form pieces of content, right? And so the references just answer the questions directly within the app. It's super low barrier for them, and the quality of work goes up. Another kind of potential use case for you guys here as well is collaboration features. So for organizational grants, obviously you might have like one main point of contact that starts a grant application, but they want to loop in other contributors, especially if it's like a research grant. So the idea here as well is they could put in like who their contributors or other people are, and then they can be then invited to join the grant application and or fill out like their own kind of form. So you might have like different departments in charge of different deliverables. It allows them to kind of all cohesively work together, each one of them working on their own time at their own pace, and not kind of like holding other people back from finishing their portions of it. So just because not a whole lot of emojis were reacted to the references, I'll just leave it at that. But it is a strong trend that we've started to see within the grant making space. I'm going to jump ahead to like kind of the review and efficiency side of things because I think that's where most of you are going to are most interested in, and then we'll come back to some of the impact reporting elements. So for many of you, when we go through a grant making process, you're collecting the grant applications, and then at some point in time, we have to take our applicants or the grantees and then share it with our team for some type of review and selection process. That in itself is a bit of a challenge. There are so many ways that you guys might decide to pair up applicants with teams. If you're an organization that offers multiple grants, you might actually have like dedicated committees or pods in charge of reviewing that particular grant. Maybe your program has multiple phases. So maybe like phase one is an LOI, and you guys want to kind of vet through them and decide who can advance on to phase two, which is a full-blown proposal. And then maybe phase three is like the final review and selection amongst your committees. So there's many ways to do that. The idea though is how do we put our review team in a position where they can kind of allocate the time and energy that the applicants deserve from them? Some of the metrics that we have suggest that on average, most volunteers or committee members very much struggle to review more than maybe 25 to 30 entries. Their energy levels fall off pretty dramatically, and there's some clear data that suggests that like the first, 5 or 6 people that they review are actually scored on a completely kind of different set of barometers and numbers like 35 through 40. So if we know that, how do we be sensitive to the review team's time and kind of balance that workload? So in a high level, it's kind of the goal there. I want to kind of walk you through a way that you can potentially address that challenge. So for me, I like to think through my grant making process as buckets, right? So leveraging automation and tools, how do we start to categorize your grant applications for you? And again, this goes back to slide number one, which is like your AI tools or your intelligence, where the system can in real time, build personas about your grantees or based off of the content that they submit. And it can start to kind of like hierarchy them for you based on how they align with what you're looking for. And B is it can start to kind of segment them and categorize them for you. So I try to merge two models into one here. So our concept of buckets basically means that you create a bucket and then you do two things. You fill it up with applicants and then you fill it up with your teams who are in charge of reviewing them. So a pretty common structure here. I've got a bucket for each of my different grants, the Bobby Gatsby grant, the Brooke Marlowe grant, et cetera. And then on top of that, I've got phases that are intertwined with it. So potentially, like after the first phase of review, we want to interview people, and then it goes on to like our board or our committees for the final selection. So the thought here is that basically we can start to share the workload amongst our staff. Now, if your team is in charge of reviewing every single grant applicant, that's great. I think it still is really important for us to segment and categorize the types of grantees that we're collecting based off of topic or whatever your personal grant making initiatives are. But in this case, we can actually then start to assign them out to different pods of people. So whenever Sally, Sue, and Steve come in to conduct their reviews, they're physically only going to see the Bobby Gatsby grant applicants. When Cindy, Tony, and Paul come in, they're only going to see the Brooke Marlowe grants. So in a way, this works really well if you've got like committees or teams in charge of reviewing. The number one emerging trend here that I want to touch on, though, is called randomized review. So if we kind of keep this in mind that we say, okay, well, my team really can't look at more than 25 to 30 people, but I've got way more submissions than that. How do we equally and fairly take your submitted applications and then distribute that out to your team in a fair, random, and automated manner? So the idea is that if in this case we open up our buckets, it'll actually show you what's going on. So it shows me in real time a list of literally every grant applicant or organization. It'll show me in real time how many people are in charge of reviewing it and then who those individuals are. So many of our clients, kind of what we're pushing for here, again, is to share the workload so we can target them by bulk selecting. And we could say something like, hey, I want every one of my grantees to get reviewed, exactly 5 times, no more, no less. Or I could do that in combination with, I want my review team to review maybe no more than 25 people, but they have to review at a bare minimum 10. So once you kind of plug in those parameters, at least with our system, it'll then equally and randomly take your grant applicants and then auto assign out to your staff based off of those metrics. From there, you can completely override it. So if you've got a conflict of interest or if one of your evaluators kind of drops off, you can start to uncheck them and then reassign that back out to other people. So I'm going to come back to this because while I love this model, it does pose a pretty significant challenge. I can kind of just go there right now. The other thing I want to introduce is a concept called judge queuing. So, in theory, I think one of the bigger challenges a lot of organizations have is this is great and dandy, but when it comes down to practice, people get tied up in other initiatives. They're volunteers. They wait to the very last minute. We still need to ensure that every applicant gets reviewed by everybody, right? Like they have to get reviewed. And ideally, they have to get reviewed in a timely manner because you have to make decisions within a certain timeline. So how do you combat the constant follow-ups with your review team? So number one is again leveraging some of the automation and intelligent tools. The system can kind of identify like which of your committee members or evaluators haven't done it yet, or who's in progress but not making much progress, and then send them automated reminders and messages, etc. But the number one way that you can combat this is kind of change the model completely. So what many people are now doing is they basically say, hey, look, here is my grant review committee, and these are all of my grant applications. What we're going to do is we're actually going to share it to everybody, right? So if I'm part of the review committee, I'm given every single grant application to review. On your end, you create a threshold. So basically, what you say is, I want every person to be reviewed 5 times or 6 times or whatever your number looks like. So what ends up happening is when the review team comes in to evaluate, they see a list of all the applications, they review them, and then once that grantee has been reviewed 5 times or whatever your metric is, it then falls off the list, so nobody else can review them. So when the review team comes in to evaluate, if they show up on their list, it means they still have to be reviewed. What this does is it empowers your team. If you have staff members who want to review multiple people because they have the bandwidth of the capacity to do so, they can. But if you've got somebody who's very well intentioned, but then they decide to go on vacation or they just can't fulfill their obligations, it's okay because somebody else will be there to pick up their slack. So I really like that model. For those of you that are going to go this route, I think the core component to that, though, is we have to randomize that list because I've seen other people attempt to do this and they basically will display the same list of applicants to their team. And it's human nature to work from top down, right? So every single evaluator reviews the same person because they're the first one on the list, right? So it gets kind of skewed with like how quickly people get evaluated. So at least within our system, that list is randomized. So if I, as Mark, the evaluator, come in, I see a completely different list than, say, for example, Leslie, because my list was random. Again, the idea still stays the same. Once the applicants hit that threshold, they fall off the list. So while we're talking about this, I want to jump really quickly to the review side, and then I want to talk about score normalization. So kind of keep in the back of your mind that what I just kind of presented is a very big emerging trend. However, it is posing a huge challenge in the fairness of the review. So once we kind of go through the pairing system, the number one goal that you guys have to have for your review teams and for your committees is to do number one, lower their barrier, and then number two, ensure that the applicants themselves get the attention that they deserve and the kind of quality selections. So what we're going to do here, obviously, and one of the other elements that we'll just touch on is the redaction of PII. If there's any data that you're collecting from a grantee that you believe either A is not relevant to the review side of things just because it's for record keeping purposes, don't give it to them. It just overwhelms them. Number two is if you're collecting any type of data that you feel like could negatively impact the perception from the review team, name, demographic details, things like that, also redact that from their point of view. We want our review teams to be reviewing the content of the applicants and the merits of them, not necessarily who they are. So in our system, and then obviously number three is lowering the barrier. So I've got 2 kids. If I'm part of your review committee, there's a strong chance I'm doing this at like 11 o'clock at night on a Wednesday. So the goal here is that they just simply click into the grant application and then they're visualizing kind of side by side the grant portfolio or like the project that was submitted. And then the other half is your selection tool. So for you guys, I think it's incredibly important to create kind of like cohesiveness amongst the review team. We want a very consistent experience for them. Every evaluator should have very clear expectations on what they're looking for. With that said, we still want them to offer like their unique perspectives and insights as they're reviewing candidates. So the idea is they can very easily side by side, read through the application form. If I go back here a little bit, all the content and deliverable that was submitted, proposals, budgets, whatever it might be. They can view file uploads directly within Reviewr. So if it's like a budget document or whatever your documents are, it'll show up side by side next to the score sheet. They can review comments, they can review notes, and then of course they can answer their scorecards. Another emerging trend that we're starting to find out is how you conduct the review. So it's kind of a data-driven mechanism where a lot of times there's like a formal, and there should be a formal rubric that the review team utilizes. We want very little subjectivity. We want a guided experience. The challenge with traditional scorecards and rubrics is they're very number-driven, right? So if you say, hey, like in this example, rank this applicant on a scale from like 0 to 20 on their grant project summary, or rank them on a scale from 1 to 15 on their funding needs. People get bogged down in numbers. So like, what's the difference between a 16 and a 17 or a 17 versus an 18? So the emerging trend that we're starting to find is how do we elicit an emotional response from your committee while still leveraging math? So in this example, it's a pretty basic one, but I think it does a good job illustrating. So for example, like on proposed budget from poor to like above average, how is their budget, is it realistic? Is it well detailed? And so from our evaluator perspective, it's much quicker for them to say, yeah, this was above average versus really, really poor. It's also a higher quality review because their initial emotional instinct is generally speaking higher quality. Now, behind the scenes, there's still points associated with this. So if I say above average, I might get 4 points. Or if I choose poor, I might just get 1. So that's really important because the review team just answers the questions, they move on to the next. But then from your perspective, you in real time get these leaderboards, and it shows you a list of literally every single grantee. It shows you the individuals who reviewed them and then how they reviewed individually, collectively, aggregates, averages, whatever it might be. So I'm not going to get too deep into this, but the main goal here, though, is for you to visualize the results. Many of our clients have multi-phase reviews, so they might take like the top 10 or 15 people, and then at the bottom, move them on to like phase two or an interview phase. Others are very cut and dry, like these are the results. And more common than not, many people are very deliberative. So they may pull this up amongst their staff and they just talk about the results, how they scored people. And just because the data says one thing doesn't mean that your committees and your team can't kind of like reallocate or change the results. From here, from a budgeting perspective, we can start to flag those that we're going to fund and start to log how much we're going to fund them for. That becomes extremely valuable, obviously, if you've got like a certain allocation, as well as how do you start to generate reports and kind of go through phase two, right? So while we're here, I do want to kind of call out the normalization. Again, I'm kind of jumping all over, but I'm trying to keep this flowing cohesively. So score normalization. For those of you that want to deploy that random review process that I talked about, which I highly recommend, number one is that it saves your time. It saves you so much time pairing up your team with applicants and sharing the workload. But the challenge with that is that that means that not every applicant or grantee gets reviewed by the same people. So what happens if you got committee members or evaluators that on average just score higher or lower than other people? And I can kind of see it happening here, right? So, for example, Mark scored this project a 12, but Judge Judy scored it a 31. So, my first question would be, okay, did Mark just not like Sheldon's application? Or what if Mark has traditionally speaking never given higher than like a 14? By his or her own standard, they actually reviewed this proposal really, really well. However, in comparison to the other committee members, this applicant is 100% being penalized for it. It's also just good insights for you guys as well to kind of figure out like, are your review staff on the same page? Is the expectations very similar amongst them? So what we can kind of do, and I'm going to jump way ahead here just to help visualize it, is with reporting capabilities and using some of those intelligent automated tools that we kind of started with, we can start to kind of visualize like the judging tendencies amongst your team and staff. So this is a real client of ours. All the data has been redacted, but the question came up is like, why is it that every single year, like whoever Judge Judy is reviewing is never selected, but everybody that Tony gets scores is? And you can kind of see that on average, Judge Judy scores about a 24 and Tony scores a 34. So it's a giant 10-point swing between the two of them. So this report and this kind of analysis is super helpful for you guys to kind of get a better understanding of like personal tendencies and trends amongst your review team. But also, we can start to take action on it, right? So, for example, with Judge Judy, do we really care if she scores way lower or higher than other people? We still value her feedback and her input. She's part of our committee for a reason. So now that we know that her average score is a 24, we in real time can start to reallocate how points are assigned. So kind of just visually looking at this, Judge Judy scored Michael a 27. So what this actually means is that Judge Judy scored Michael, almost 3 points higher than her personal average. Whereas Elon here was scored a 16, which means he was scored, a full 4 or 5 points lower than her personal average. So now that we know kind of like their own averages and then how they're scoring, we then compare that to one another. So the end results, if you go this route, are kind of cool because what happens is instead of saying like, hey, our highest rated applicant scored a 26, it instead would say something like they were scored a 1.15, which means that collectively amongst our team, they scored about 1.15 times higher than the typical average, whereas the lowest rated applicant scored almost 20% lower than the collective average. So we have many of our clients that have shifted to using this as their final selection tool. It kind of takes away all subjectivity and it kind of takes into consideration like the personal tendencies of the judges, but it also doesn't penalize an applicant who unfortunately was paired up with a tough evaluator. So I want to make sure I touch on this because again, going back to like the review pairing side of things, I'm a huge advocate of like balancing workloads and capacity. And the only way that you can do that is via kind of randomization and automation. But if you go that route, it's going to pose the challenge I just mentioned. So, one kind of last thing I want to touch on here, and then we'll just do a ton of Q&A, is impact reporting. So, for me, this is like the number one topic I love to talk about. Again, coming from this space, how do we as donors or as sponsors, or how do we as potential funders, work with you guys as a grant making organization and say, hey, like, what is the ROI our program is having on people or organizations' lives? And in general, like the concept should be quite simple. We know who our grantees are, where they're going through the process. We should be able to measure the impact, right? The challenge with that is it's very, very difficult to get grant recipients to come back and give you guys the data that you need to make those informed decisions. So the only way that you can do this is again two-part. Number one is we have to physically lower the barrier for ongoing data collection from grantees. And number two is once we have that data, we have to be able to actually do something with it and visualize it. So the idea, at least within a Reviewr, I'm going to jump here up to a different example is we have on their profiles a section called supplemental forms. And so for every single person that gets selected for a grant or for a scholarship, they're moved into a new workflow, right? Because they were selected. Obviously, those that don't get selected, we don't want to be able to unlock these elements. But they would get some type of very simple notification. And ideally, you guys will kind of put this on a timeline. So like, is it a 6-month report? Is it a 1-year report? Is it just a final report? That's very unique to every organization. But then when they come back in, they just click add, and then it pops up and says, well, what do you want to add? And this is the core component here is, again, we want to make it simple for them to do this, but also you guys have to be able to systematize it. So we create templates. So it could be like a final grant impact report or whatever the deliverables that you need are. But the idea is that you kind of create consistent data amongst all grantees. So for them, it makes it very, very simple. They just simply click on the grant reporting template and then boom, it pops up. So for them, it's a very low barrier. I think a lot of grant making organizations are doing a great job kind of going down the path of creating systems and using technology. But then once the programs wrap up, then they kind of revert back to like having grantees submit them emails with their reports or filling out online forms. When that happens, again, number one, it's a higher barrier for the grantee to actually do it. And your information becomes very disconnected because you have to go find the reports, reconnect it to their application, and then you really can't report back on it. So in this example, this organization fills out their grant impact report. So dates and deadlines, we want to know like what were your stated goals versus the actual outcomes, and if there's any discrepancies, explain it. Like what were some of the KPIs that we're going to help hold each other accountable for? What was some of the quantitative and qualitative impact that we had? Budget breakdowns, right? Like how much of it was exhausted? Are you going to be raising additional funds? Do you have updated budgets? Is this a grant where like you might actually fund them for over the course of multiple years? If so, that's really going to be important. But the idea here is that they just with one click answer these questions. And then once they submit it, it actually gets stuck back on their profile. So kind of coming full circle, we have in this case the grantee who created a profile. They went through like the matching tool, they fill out their application, they uploaded their files, they went through review and selection. All of our activity and communication is logged. And then now we have all this additional forms or surveys that they're filling out, living with all of that. So for you guys, it creates a tremendous amount of opportunity because you can start to generate dashboards and reports that says, hey, here's like the breakdown of the type of applicants we received. Here's how we kind of went through our funding process. Here's how the funds were allocated. And here's the impact that we had, right? So like completion rates of projects, ongoing funding deliverables needed, right? Whatever your internal KPIs are that you want to track, it can be system generated with like literally one click because all the data kind of lives together. So I'll kind of just pause there. I want to make sure I leave ample time for, whatever questions and comments that you might have. But to kind of quickly summarize as I'm waiting for questions, some of the core kind of emerging trends that we're seeing again right now is clearly having some type of like dedicated management system, not just to help streamline your time, but also keeping in mind that from an applicant perspective, it's a digital era. So it has to be, compliant for ADA compliancy. It has to be mobile responsive, right? Like you only have one chance to convert them. Obviously, from an operation perspective, you guys should be focusing on your mission and your vision. So letting technology and tools save you guys the bulk of the operational legwork. And then I think the often overlooked demographic is your review team. Again, a lot of times they are volunteers and or they have other obligations. And so how do we put them into a position where they can very quickly and very easily access who they're supposed to be reviewing, offer their insights, offer their feedbacks, while at the same time making sure that the applicants got the fair, non-biased selection that they deserved. For those of you who kind of go through compliance audits, that's also going to be necessary. From an applicant perspective, again, if you have multiple different types of grants or eligibility criteria, all the time and energy that you guys spend vetting eligibility, making sure that they met the requirements and that you got the deliverables can be completely automated and eliminated. Obviously the future of AI, which we can kind of come back to, is an evolving space. A lot of things that we talked about here, such as like summarizing of content, doing those reviewer assignments, doing your eligibility screening or matching, all that stuff, right away can be done. So with all that said, I ran, about 10 minutes long. What kind of questions can I answer? And as I'm waiting for those questions to trickle in, give us a couple hours. We will send out a follow-up with all of these resources. So again, not to underemphasize, there's a lot of information about like kind of what the concept is, why it's important, how to implement it, and then very much like action items that each one of you guys can take right now. So we'll send that out with the recap. So a couple questions have come in, and I'll start to address them as we go. One of you applies through the USDA grant sources, and it's often required to have a letter of support. Yeah, so again, it depends if you're a grant making organization, if you're a grant writer, but I do see a lot of recommendation letters as a common trend. It's also very challenging. So traditionally speaking, as a grant maker, if you are collecting references, what's going to end up happening is the person who is submitting it doesn't want to submit it directly through the applicant. They want to submit it to you directly. And so you're basically going to be getting a bunch of emails from references saying, hey, here's my reference. You've got no idea who they are. You have no idea who they belong to. You have to somehow merge the information. And then on top of that, just writing references can be extremely cumbersome, yet it's a requirement. So how do we make sure that A, all the references can do it? B, how do we ensure that it's high quality? And then C, how do we connect it back to the source? So we can automate all of that. One thing kind of too to touch on is on your dashboarding within Reviewr. I talked about visibility for communication. That is one of the points of communication. So we can actually see how many people have been requested to submit those references. Are they done or not done? And if they're not done, we can also send reminder messages and automate that as well. Do we integrate with any CRMs? Yeah, so high level integration is a kind of a broad term. There's things like single sign-on, there's, pulling data from the CRM into Reviewr, and then there's kind of like bilateral, us passing data back to them. So since there's so many CRMs out there, like we have to explore like what type of integration you're looking for and like where does it actually provide value. But yes, we've done it a substantial number of times. Question came out about like reducing email overload, even if you're using Reviewr to send automated communications. So yeah, it's kind of a polarizing topic. You definitely don't want to be like harassing or bombarding people with communication. So like there's certainly some best practices around like what those cadences should look like, and they have to be adaptive. So what I mean by that is if I go back here, like my dashboarding, and let's just hypothetically say that I want to send like reminder messages to those that have incomplete submissions. Like you don't want to be sending those daily if your deadline is still like 3 weeks out, because again, human nature means they're not going to finish until the last 48 hours. So maybe it's like once every week, week and a half, and then as your deadlines approach, that cadence starts to increase frequency. Similar concept goes with your review team and your review committees. If you give your team, say, for example, like 3 weeks to review, they're not going to spend 3 weeks reviewing, right? They're going to carve out a segment in time that they have available to actually knock it out. So sending them a ton of reminders right away doesn't make sense. However, if your deadline's in 3 days, okay, then that frequency needs to amp up. So at least with our system, you guys can create email templates and send them whenever you want. Or if you are going to automate them, you guys can set like the cadence and change the frequency on demand. With all that said, I am an advocate of over communicating. People have really good intentions. Things come up. And for me, it's all about the experience. So from like an applicant perspective, if I've got somebody who I know has started creating their grant application and they didn't just like open it and left, right? Like they actually started to contribute to it. I want to make sure that they have a chance to have success, right? So for me to send them automated reminder messages, I think it's a good thing because that person eventually needs to finish and they're just not going to remember until the deadline. So the question came in on the eligibility questions, if it's like on generic criteria or specific to the grants available. My recommendation would be certainly for the grants available. So at least within our system, it's a pretty kind of comprehensive matching tool where for every single grant opportunity that you have, you can kind of load in the many different requirements that you also have. And so what happens then is it depends on how you want to do it. If you're doing just eligibility checks, once they choose the grant that they're applying for, then they start to answer some questions, and then the check kicks in and says, "Hey, so for example, I'm based out of Lincoln, Nebraska. If you're offering a grant to those that live in like New York, one of those questions would then knock me out because it says, oh, this is only available to those in New York. If it's for the matching side of things, it actually becomes more powerful because we start to interconnect all the different requirements. So the system will say, hey, based on what you just said, we just did a quick lookup against all of the different grants, and here's the ones that you actually meet eligibility requirements for. And then from there, they can start to pick and choose which grants they want to apply for. Great question. Other questions I can answer. And to be clear, when I ask for like questions, it doesn't have to be necessarily related to like these topics today. It doesn't have to be reviewer related. I'm very fortunate to be in the position where I work with thousands of people like yourselves. And so on a daily basis, I'm hearing, challenges that they're facing and some of these trends that are probably also relevant to many of you. So if I don't have answers, I surely can help kind of align resources to make sure we get you guys the help that we can. So yeah, challenges getting feedback through surveys and supplemental forums, best practices here. So yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it comes back to level setting expectations. So I feel like a lot of times we as organizations have intentions of like, okay, when the grants are funded, we need the person to come back and fill out those surveys or those impact statements. But like what is the obligation that the applicant has for that, right? So for me, a lot of times I actually start it right away. Once I go through the grant selection process and we say, hey, we're going to fund these individuals, my very first step is to use supplemental forms to do a grant acceptance, right? And in that acceptance, you're going to get information, right? Like where the check should be cut, all those kind of nitty-gritty accounting elements, but then also like an agreement or an acceptance to the grant. And one of those elements is, we need you to come back at this point of time and submit these additional deliverables. So they're basically saying, like, by agreeing to receiving a grant from your organization, I am committing to doing that. So then you have kind of like an actual contractual obligation with them to do it. Um, Number two is making sure they're actually aware that they have to do it. So it kind of goes back to the agreement, but I think a lot of times people are taken back. And so, maybe it's not necessarily that they didn't know they should be submitting the impact reports, but maybe they don't actually have the data on hand that they need to submit it, right? So they're kind of just like kicking the can down the road and delaying it until they can do it. So what I would also do is say, hey, once we're selected for a grant, not only do we need you to commit to coming back at this time frame to submit your deliverables, but also here's what we're going to be requesting from them. That way, in real time, as they're kind of going through their funding process, they can start to measure the results and kind of start compiling it. So when the time comes to actually submit their grant impact reports, it's not then creating it from scratch. They actually already have all the insights that they need to fill it out. So a question came in about like, do we have the features to help manage grants that have already been awarded? Yeah, so I think it largely comes down to like what do you want to do to manage it? Is it, tracking spending? Is it tracking budgets? Is it tracking like the ongoing grant deliverables? Is it tracking communication? So like the answer is yes, we have all of those elements, but that's a very kind of like subjective. Every organization has different, I guess, experiences or interactions that they want to have with the grantees. And so it's all about kind of like defining, like holistically from a life cycle perspective, like what does that look like for you? The very obvious, is like you've got like your grant application cycle, you've got the review and selection cycle, and then you've got the trail on, which is ongoing data collection from them. What lives in between are like what are those interactions or what are you trying to manage amongst the awarded funds? And so, again, if it's like a multi-tiered grant where like you've got a certain budget and you're going to allocate X funds now, and then maybe like 6 months you're going to unlock additional funds, or maybe it's renewable, so you have to come back and reapply, and then you're going to grant them the additional funds. Those are kind of the unique nuances that obviously are configurable within our system. And then kind of one question too, going back to like challenges getting feedback through surveys and the supplemental forms. So people don't wake up every morning thinking like, all right, I'm going to wake up and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do my annual report or whatever, those deliverables are. So I think leveraging kind of like your metrics here to kind of figure out like who's actually in that stage, who's done it versus who hasn't done it. And then out of those that haven't done it, like where are they? Have they started it or they've never even started it at all? And then leveraging automated reminders and messaging to them as well, because again, they have to do it. Question came in around like, does Reviewr also inform you of like why a particular grant was not awarded? So you can have feedback on how you can prepare for the next cycle. So just to make sure we're on the same page, Reviewr itself is not like a grant writing tool. So it's not a tool for you guys to manage the grants that you're actively applying for. It's a platform intended for grant makers to manage that process. With that said, those that use Reviewr should be helping you out. So in our system, there actually is a feedback mechanism. And again, this is another, I guess, I wouldn't say emerging trend, but it is a bit polarizing. Is on my end, like I love to see organizations that as they conduct their grant reviews, they don't just ship off automated, like, yes, you were accepted or no, you were not accepted. For those that get declined or don't receive funding, I would love for you guys to share with them why. And Reviewr makes it very simple. You guys can aggregate comments and notes. We have a lot of our clients that are extremely transparent, so they actually will share back virtually within Reviewr the results. So as a grant submitter, they could get a notification, come back into Reviewr, and then see a list of all the quote unquote like criteria or scorecards that were submitted about them. And they can all be redacted. And then you as a grant writer can physically see exactly how you were scored. And then you can leverage that information for like self-development and improvements for future grants. So yeah, that's more of like a best practice. And for those of you who are on the call, I hope we all kind of heard that because what we're hearing, I think, is direct feedback from a grant writer who in the past potentially has had a poor experience being told that they weren't funded, but then they have no idea why or how they can personally improve. So I really do appreciate everybody's not just attendance and time, but also like the active participation. This is my favorite part about kind of what I do. I love being able to bridge the gap with the thousands of groups that we work with, and also just like the industry challenge that we're all facing. The beauty of what you guys are doing is that none of us are competitive with one another. The in recent light of some of the challenges that the world's been facing, foundations, nonprofits, and grant making institutions are absolutely vital to like the long-term success of like organizational and community building. So I applaud you for the great work that you're doing, and I want to make sure that I'm here to be a resource to help you guys with your initiatives. Obviously, if you want to leverage a platform like Reviewr, I'd love to have that conversation. But again, on top of that, if there's anything else I can do, any challenges that you guys are running into or any kind of barriers or roadblocks, you're not in this alone. The beauty again is that we have hopefully a substantial number of resources and introductions that we can make to assist. So, as always, if there's anything else I can do for you guys, please do let me know. But with that said, I'll wrap it up. I really appreciate it today.